Well, welcome to the final episode of the series. I had actually no idea that it would take 6 weeks to get through the Gospels. I'd originally planned to do this in the previous series when I was looking at the life of Jesus. I thought I'll just do an episode in there on the Gospels, which I'm glad I didn't at the time. And so it's actually become 6 episodes over here. So anyway, hopefully you're still following along with it. Hopefully it's been helpful. There's a lot to talk about, actually. And we're really not actually even scratching the surface of the Gospels themselves. What I've tried to do is to focus on just the story behind them. What is a gospel, which is obviously the title of the series, but, what's the story behind them? And, just the whole theme of this show is to really look at what's going on behind the text, and so hopefully give you something of a starting point in your own reading of them yourself, so you can sort of go away from this and look at them again, all of these texts again, and see them hopefully in a different light, hopefully see them in a new way, and certainly in a helpful way. So anyway, that's the intention of it. And what we're going to look at in this last episode are the remaining 3 Gospels. We looked at Mark last week, so this week we'll obviously look at Matthew, Luke, and John. And I was actually asked through the week, how on earth am I going to get this finished? Well, I'm not going to go into the texts themselves. I could probably do a couple of episodes on each of the Gospels, and may do one day. We'll see how all of this plays out. But I want to sort of just get the story behind the text and the lead-up story to them. Why were they written? Who wrote them? Why were they written? What's their basic objective in their creation? So that's what we'll get to. That's what we'll sort of hopefully cover with today's topic. So just by way of recap, what we established over the last couple of weeks, and certainly last week, was that we have 4 Gospels, but they're written from 4 different perspectives, or they're trying to see Jesus from 4 different perspectives. Now, if you've just read them once through, and certainly if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke one after the other, you sort of feel like you're reading the same story again. And when you read it the first time, and you're not really looking for any differences, that's an understandable conclusion to come to, because they really do read the same. And the reason for that we saw last week was because actually Mark was the first gospel, but then Matthew and Luke came along afterwards and used Mark as the framework for their Gospels. Now, Mark's Gospel itself, if you recall, is actually Peter's Gospel. So Mark was a student of Peter, and so what Mark has done is really just to gather together the memories of Peter that he's learned and then written them down probably shortly after Peter's death. And the reason for the writing of these Gospels was because the original disciples, the ones who really were the stewards of these traditions, were dying, and the original thought that Jesus was coming back within their lifetimes. Well, that's past, obviously, because he hasn't come back yet and we're about to die. So what the students have done is to then sort of come along and recount those stories and create the Gospels as a result of that. So that's the reason why they're sort of written when they were, at least 3 or 4 decades after the life of Jesus, which is still fairly close by historical sort of comparison, but still somewhat of a time after the life and death of Jesus. So the first gospel we'll look at is Matthew. Now, just a bit of a heads up with this episode. It's going to be just a bit more, here's just a bunch of facts around the gospels, maybe not so much storytelling. So just a bit more of the, here are the bullet points that are helpful to understand. So take that for whatever it is. It might just sound like a bit of a different episode to what I would normally do. But again, hopefully it's helpful. It hopefully gives you sort of a helpful framework of what you're looking at here when you look at the Gospels. So the first Gospel we'll look at then is Matthew, which obviously is the first one in our New Testaments, but not the first one written. Mark, as we said, was the first one that was written. And so when they actually came to put together the New Testament, when they canonized it, actually they did a number of weird things that we're going to look at. The first one was to actually put Matthew first in the Gospels, or in the New Testament. There's a reason for that, but it does, without knowing anything else, give you the sense that Matthew must have been the first gospel and then everybody else came afterwards. That's obviously not the case, but Matthew does come first. There's a reason for that. Now, when it comes to Matthew's gospel itself, in fact, with all of these gospels, very early on in our church tradition, the authorship had been established. Now, in the earliest examples that we would have of these gospels, there would have been some sort of title page that would indicate who wrote them. The texts themselves don't actually have the author written in there. It's not like halfway through Matthew's going, oh, and by the way, don't forget that it's Matthew that's writing this. Like, you don't write that when you write in biography. You write in the life of somebody else. You don't talk about yourself. That's not the point. You keep the focus on the person you're writing about. So we don't actually have references to the authors themselves to give us a clue as to who they are, or to give us confirmation. But what we do have are some clues. And so what we get in the Gospel of Matthew are a couple of clues which would sort of suggest to us that it would be the Matthew that it's been attributed to, but specifically Matthew, or who was known as Levi, Matthew the tax collector. And so again, apart from the church tradition that suggests that he was the one, there are these other clues that we have. So one of the best clues actually comes at the very sort of early on in the gospel itself, and it's when the 12 disciples are being named. So if you look at Mark's account, remembering when Mark wrote this gospel, when Matthew wrote his gospel, he was using Mark as his starting point. He was the framework and the majority of the content of Mark's gospel was the starting point for Matthew. And then what he did was to expand that, sort of break it open a little bit, and then add his own material along the way. But one of the parts that he's certainly kept is Mark's accounting of the 12 disciples as they were being called. And you look at the way that they were named in Mark's accounting, Mark 3, it says that these are the 12 appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. And so it's interesting that he's sort of stressing that, to whom he gave the name Peter, sort of gives us an indication from Mark's point of view that was Peter, his teacher. Sort of the fact that he puts Peter first to begin with, but also that he expands on that idea that, this is the one that became Peter later on. You kind of sort of hear Peter's priority coming through that, because again, that was Peter's gospel. But anyway, beside the point. But then he says Matthew and then Thomas, as he's listening through, just Matthew gets the name Matthew, like the rest of the disciples, Matthew, Thomas, Judas. They're all sort of just, here's their names. You know their names, but here they are. Luke does the same thing. Luke is drawing directly from Mark's gospel, and so he does the same thing. Simon, whom he named Peter, Matthew, Thomas. So Matthew is just one of the generic one of the generic disciples amongst the 12. That's just his name. But when you actually come to Matthew's gospel, Matthew 10, he's doing the same list. And this point of the story is when Jesus kind of confirms who the 12 are. And so, these are the 12 that Jesus appointed. Again, you've got Simon, who is called Peter, so directly taking that from Mark. But then it says Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. So only Matthew's gospel has that, Matthew the tax collector, to stress which Matthew we're talking about, but to sort of shine a spotlight on him as well. Simon, who became Peter, still gets the main spotlight, but Matthew gets the spotlight in Matthew's gospel, which makes you sort of think, okay, there's something going on here. There's someone behind this. You didn't have to stress that. You could have said Judas the traitor. You could have said Thomas the doubter, but you say, no, Matthew the tax collector. Well, that's probably because Matthew was behind this in some way. So that sort of gives us a little bit of a clue, perhaps, as to Matthew's authorship of this gospel. But another one comes in Mark 2 and Luke 5. It's the story of when Matthew actually gets called. So Luke, drawing on Mark, uses the same wording, exactly the same statement, which is, as he was walking along, talking about Jesus, as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. So this is the calling of Matthew. Levi was, or the other name that he goes by. But when it comes to Matthew, Matthew's account of this story, it says, as Jesus went from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Why does he stress the Matthew? Well, because by this point, Matthew's the name that he's going by. Levi was maybe the name that he used to go by, but now it's Matthew. Well, that's the name he's going by, so he's going to make that change. He's going to stress the fact that this is Matthew. Why again? Well, probably because Matthew's the one behind this. So All this to say, these are just like a couple of little clues that would suggest to us that Matthew is the one that's behind this particular gospel. So then which Matthew are we talking about? Well, the traditional view, of course, is that it's Matthew the tax collector, so one of the 12. Now that raises a couple of questions for us. If it is Matthew, one of the 12, probably the biggest question you would have to ask is, why is he using Mark's gospel? Mark wasn't there. Mark was, if he was even alive during the time of Jesus, would have only been a young boy. So why on earth would Matthew, an actual authority on the life of Jesus, someone who was actually there with him and saw these stories with his own eyes, why would he rely on Mark, who was only a kid at the time and who's writing in the gospel from somebody else's account? Like that's a big question. That's an important question, which would sort of cast some doubt, or at the very least raise some questions as to which Matthew are we actually talking about. And the second issue that gets raised by this is that if Mark was writing in about 70, which we saw last week was when he was established, that would mean that Matthew was writing his gospel a good 10 years later, quite a few years afterwards. He wouldn't have been writing the next month. It would have been a few years for Mark's gospel to have become the accepted gospel. Remembering that Mark wrote this one down, but it would have taken a couple of years for it to be established as sort of by the overall church at the time, that this is something we're going to rely on. Mark's gospel had to sort of earn that authority. There was so many other traditions that were getting around. This Mark sitting down and collecting into this particular gospel would raise the question, well, why are we going to trust this? Well, eventually it did get trusted. So that would at least say to us that when Matthew if he's dependent on Mark writing later on, would have to be quite a few years afterwards. Now, that would make Matthew very, very old when he wrote this gospel. Let's just say that it was written down in the year 80. 10 years after the writing of Mark, probably 80 would be sort of the earliest. I think we could probably date it if that was the case. That would make Matthew extremely old at that point. Now, we don't know how old Matthew was. We simply don't. But what we can say fairly safely is that the disciples would have been young men when Jesus called them. So let's just say Jesus called them, say, about 28, for example. It's generally agreed that's around the time of Jesus' ministry. So let's say that he called them when they were in the year 28. Get this image out of your head that Jesus is calling these old men. You think about some of the movies you might have seen or paintings you see where the disciples following Jesus are these grey-bearded old men. That's just a silly idea. Jesus would not call students that are much older than himself, and he certainly wouldn't call students that are on the other end of life, that close to the grave. He's going to call young men. And so the disciples at the time of Jesus' calling would have been late teens, maybe early 20s at the absolute most. So at the very least, if Jesus calls them in 28, and let's just say for argument's sake that Matthew is 20 at the time when he was called, that would still mean that in the year 80, Matthew would be early 70s. Now, that's an age that everybody would generally live to today, but it's a much rarer age for people to live to in the ancient world. Now, he still very much could have been alive, but he would have been a much older man by that point. So that sort of at least causes some questions over which Matthew that we're talking about. Matthew, the disciple, then why would he use Mark? And then Matthew, who would have been much older at that point. Well, to the first question, the answer would probably be, or the answer would almost certainly be, that he's using Mark because, remember, it's not Mark's gospel. It's not that Mark's writing down any of his memories. He doesn't have memories of Jesus, but what he's writing down are Peter's memories. And so Peter has become the head of the church. Now, James, of course, James, the brother of Jesus, becomes the head of the church in Jerusalem. But by the time of Mark, Peter has really become established as, well, at least in the Catholic Church, the first pope. He really takes the crown, or takes the position as the head of the church. And so Peter, being an authoritative voice on the matter, his gospel is going to take preeminence over the others, or it's certainly going to have enough importance for somebody like Matthew to say, look, I'm starting with Peter's story, and then I'm going to add a lot of my own to that as well. So that would at least give some explanation as to why Matthew would choose to use Mark. But then in terms of the age of it, now, if if I said 80, it could have even been after that. And was Matthew even alive at that point? How old would he have been at that point? Well, it may have been a very, very old Matthew that wrote it down, or what it may have been are his students. So Matthew would have had his own sort of set of traditions. He would have had his own sort of school that would have emerged. These 12 disciples weren't just working as a collective and, there was some sort of, round table collective that everybody came out of. They were out there doing the work that Jesus sent them out, right? They went out and they were establishing churches. They were the first church planters. Some of them stayed back in Jerusalem, but the rest of them were out there doing the work. Like Peter dies in Rome. Why did he die in Rome? Well, he was out there doing evangelistic work. So Matthew would have done the same thing. And from those disciples would have been established schools. They would have been students of Matthew, students of John, students of Peter. All of these guys would have had their own sort of schools, all coming from Jesus and all sort of holding to the same set of traditions, but establishing schools around the Roman Empire so that it's not just like one person doing all the work. Of course, Jesus appointed 12 so that he had 12 people to go and start this movement. So Matthew would have had his own school. It would have been the students in his school and maybe even helped Matthew write it if he was an old man, or at the very least recalling their own memories that they've picked up from Matthew, from their teacher, in the same way that Mark has written Peter's gospel. These students, these unnamed students, would have been writing Matthew's gospel. But what Matthew is doing, well, what these authors are doing, is that they're adding their own set of Matthean traditions. They've got Q. We already saw last week that Luke and Matthew draw from this same Q, this Quella, this source gospel that runs alongside Mark. So this other set of traditions, they've both drawn on that same set of traditions. But then in addition to that, what they've also added is some of their own stuff as well. Some of the stuff that only sort of came through into Matthew's school. So one clear example of this would be the genealogy that Matthew has at the start of his gospel. So that particular so Luke has his own genealogy, but Matthew's is quite different to that one. So where did that particular genealogy come from? Well, that would have been part of the Matthean tradition. So what he's done, or the authors have done, is drawn on these other two sources, and that's what's created Matthew's gospel. Now, the bigger question about Matthew's gospel is, why was it written? What was the purpose of it? Remembering that they've all got different purposes. What we have with Matthew's gospel is much more of Jesus the teacher. That's really the priority that Matthew is stressing here. And so we see this coming through, particularly in the fact that Jesus is continually having debates with other teachers of the law. That seems to be one of the main priorities. He always seems to be in these sort of debates and these arguments with the Pharisees. And so then what we're being introduced to is Jesus the teacher. And really what one of the purposes then becomes is that we see how to do discipleship. We see Jesus doing his training of his disciples. We get sort of a sense of how to do that ourselves. But even more than that, what Matthew is really writing here is a Jewish gospel. He's showing how Jesus is the continuation of the Old Covenant, how he completes the Old Covenant and then brings that into the New Testament, which is why Matthew was placed first. Matthew is prioritized at the beginning of the New Testament because it forms that bridge between the Old and the New. So you can read Matthew and you can see the Old Testament being wrapped up in the life of Jesus, and then you can see, and it sort of finishes then with his Great Commission, which is now go out in this new covenant, but go into all the world. I'm not just here for the people for the people of God in Israel. I'm here for everybody, and so there's that natural connecting point between them that Matthew brings, hence again why it was placed at the start of the New Testament canon. But there was another more immediate reason for Matthew writing this gospel. The other one was more for just the general purpose of it, the characteristic of Jesus, the teacher. That's more of a universal point that Matthew wants to introduce to his readers. But what he also wants to do for his own audience is to give them a sense of, or give them some encouragement in their following of Jesus. What we generally assume is that Matthew's gospel is written more towards the Jewish community. It's written to Christians who are living in and near synagogue communities. So people more in the Jewish areas around sort of Israel or around Judea, around those sort of areas. the Christians living there are facing a particular kind of persecution that some other Christians more out in places like Rome that they're simply not facing, which is pressure from the synagogue. So the challenge to being a Christian in the Jewish world is that you're an apostate. By saying that Jesus is God, by saying that he's the Messiah, that makes you an apostate. And what that's going to result in is a lot of tension between you and your family, you and your Jewish community. And you pretty much, it's going to come to a point where you're not going to be welcome in the synagogue anymore. And if you're not welcome in the synagogue, you've basically lost your connection to the Jewish community, including your family. So that was always a challenge. And we see that through Paul's missionary work. We see that early on in Jerusalem in the early chapters of Acts. But what happens after the year 70? 70 is when the temple of Jerusalem is destroyed, and that creates a whole different set of issues we'll come to in another series. But what happens there is that the divide between the Jews and the Christians is really exacerbated at that point. Now that there's no temple, that changes the whole nature of Judaism, and it really sort of solidifies the sort of some of the other sort of Pharisaic traditions which are opposed to the Christian message. And so if you're going to be Jewish, you're really on the side of the Pharisees at that point. And if you're a Christian and you're opposed to that, then you are more ostracized as a result. So Christians are going to face heavier persecution, and particularly from the teachers of the law. So what Matthew is trying to do for his audience is to highlight the struggles that Jesus had with the teachers of the law, to show the Christians of his world and of his time that, you know what, this is how it's always been. If you're facing trouble from Jewish teachers of the law, that's how it was back in Jesus' time. And so you're still on the right side of history here. Like, you're still in the right place, even though you're being persecuted by this community. So that's why we get much more of an emphasis, or much more of a Jesus being opposed to the Pharisees, particularly in chapters like Matthew 23, where Jesus is sort of going off on the Pharisees, you hypocrites, you hypocrites. You only get that attack in Matthew. That particular account is another one that's unique to Matthew. You get a few mentions of Jesus calling them hypocrites in the other Gospels, but Matthew is really strong with that. And it's Jesus just going on a rant against the Pharisees. Well, that's because Matthew's got his Jewish audience in mind. So he's stressing that side of it. So Matthew is very unique in that way, in more of its Jewish flavor, but more of its encouragement to especially Jewish Christians who are facing this persecution. And so on the whole, guys, again, to recap, what Matthew is doing is bringing the story of the Old Testament into the New Testament. He's showing how Jesus is the completion of the Old Covenant and then leading that into the New, but also showing then how Jesus was a teacher, establishing him in that role, and then giving us the example for how to do that. And so that's why Matthew, as a gospel itself, historically has been one that has been a great source of inspiration for teaching. It's been a great source for discipleship, which is precisely what side of Jesus it's demonstrating. So that continues on sort of more universally for all of us as well. So that's our first of what we call the Synoptic Gospels. If you remember last week, we talked about Matthew, Mark, and Luke as being what we call the Synoptic Gospels, because they're seeing the same view. They've got the same view towards Jesus, only with some slight variation. And so that Matthew is one of the synoptics, drawing from Mark, but the other one, of course, is Luke. So Luke is the other one that we see with a lot of similarities to Mark. But what you also notice about Luke is that he's got, using Matthew's other source of cue, but also drawing his own sources as well. Stories like, for example, the Good Samaritan. That only turns up in Luke's Gospel. Why does it only turn up in Luke's Gospel? Well, because what it portrays for us is the story of a Gentile, a non-Jew, helping a Jewish man. And so if you remember that story where you've got the guy who's been robbed and beaten up and left for dead on the side of the road. And so what you see happening there is that the priests come along and the teachers of the law come along, and they all just walk right by the man, walk on the other side of the road. But the person who does help him is a Samaritan, the traditional enemy of the Jewish people. Now, why would Luke tell a story about essentially a Gentile helping a Jewish person? Well, because Luke himself is a Gentile, and he's writing to a largely Gentile audience, which is effectively the rest of the world. Luke is a Greek. And now, of course, we should establish which Luke we're talking about, but with the traditional view being that this is Luke, the physician, Luke, the student of Paul, Luke, the companion of Paul. We know that guy's a Greek. We know that this guy is a Gentile. And so when he's writing his gospel, he's got his people in mind. Matthew's gospel is written to his people, which are the Jewish people, whereas Luke is writing to more of a broad, worldwide Gentile audience, certainly Jews as well, but he's got the whole Christian community in mind. So he's naturally going to stress much more of the Gentile aspect of Jesus, one of those being the story of this Good Samaritan. So like Matthew's gospel, Luke sort of very early on has been attributed to its sort of supposed author, which is in this case Luke the physician. Now again, Luke's name doesn't appear throughout, but once again, we have clues. The clues, however, come in the book of Acts. Now, the key thing to remember, of course, with Luke and Acts is that it's one work in two parts. Now, again, one of these issues of when they put the canon together, they put Matthew before Mark, and then they split Luke and Acts up. You know, they've got Luke and then John and then Acts. And you just think, hang on a second. I remember when I first read this, I'm reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's like, hang on, I just read the same story 3 times. Then I get to John, and it's like, oh, that's a different story. Okay, that's cool. And then I get back to Acts, and it's like, hang on a second. I feel like I've just read this start, because at the start of both of the books, you've got this reference to this guy Theophilus, and you go, hey, I thought I just saw that, and he says in my previous book Theophilus, and you go, what are we talking about? And it's going back to Luke. So somehow some idiot has put John in between these two books. But anyway, to note that it's the same work. It's one work in two parts. Now, the reason why he split it up into two was simply because he didn't have a scroll long enough to put it into one work. It's such a long work. In fact, it takes up 25% of the New Testament, Luke and Acts together. It's an absolutely massive document or set of documents. And so Luke had to spread it out over 2 pieces of papyrus because they didn't make them big enough to contain all of this in one. And so when you put Luke and Acts together and you sort of spread it out, what you notice is that they're basically both the same size, which again gives us a sense of the measurement, the physical measurement of the papyrus that he was using, that they're both basically the same amount of words in each one. So Luke's sort of taken these 2 pieces and got the maximum usage that he could out of both of these pieces of papyrus. But the point being that they're the 2 works together, and have to be understood in that way. And so the clues then that we get from of the authorship actually comes later on in Acts, specifically beginning in Acts 16:10. What happens there is that the narrative or the narrator's perspective changes. So it goes from telling the story from sort of an external point of view that, Peter did this and then Paul did this. It goes from that to we. So the narrator joins into the story. And you go, okay, that doesn't tell us that exactly who it is, but it does give us an indication that whoever is now mentioned within that group with Paul is the person who's doing this writing. So that narrows it down quite significantly, because what Paul has got at this point is a small team of students along with him. And the we narrative, the we passage continues on all the way to the end when Paul's in Rome. So Paul's imprisoned in Rome, and it's still talking about we. We joined Paul. We accompanied Paul all the way into Rome. And so then we know from later on, from Paul's letters that are written from Rome in prison, that Luke was there accompanying him in prison. And so we get mention in Colossians as well as in Philemon of our dear friend Luke sends you his greetings. So Luke, through sort of that series of deduction, he gets identified as the man, as the one who does this right, as the one who writes this gospel. Certainly that's the traditional view of the authorship of this. Now, again, we've already established that Luke depends on Mark. Mark was written, say, about 70, which would place Luke later on, at least another 10 years, well after the life of Paul. But Luke, being a student of Paul, that's what actually gives Luke the authority to have a gospel in the first place. When the New Testament was canonized, there were a couple of key criteria that gave whatever the texts were any sort of authority as being part of the New Testament. That was either that was written by one of the original 12 or one of the disciples, which is that therefore including Paul, or somebody directly associated with them. Well, Luke clearly wasn't one of the disciples. He was Paul's student, but by virtue of being Paul's student is what gives it the authority, the credibility to be able to be canonized in the first place. And so Luke is therefore picking up on the traditions that Paul would have passed on to him. Paul would have received those from Peter himself as well, and also been commissioned by Jesus personally. But Luke starts with Mark in the same way that Matthew has by the time that Luke's writing, probably 80, maybe a bit after. Mark is well and truly the established gospel. That is our fundamental document, that we sort of our go-to document. And so naturally Luke is going to draw from that. He's also going to draw from Q, as we've seen, and then from his own sources as well, those including the ones from Paul. Now, we actually saw one of these traditions early on where, in a couple of weeks ago, where Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 11, talks about sort of the Last Supper, or talks about this, the tradition of breaking bread. That was what Paul passed on to his churches in wherever he went, and we see him repeating that in Corinthians 11. The tradition of on the final night he broke bread, he poured out the wine on the night of his death. We find word for word in Luke's gospel that same account. So the story itself, when Luke is telling that story of Jesus at the Last Supper, he's drawing word from the tradition that he's received from Paul. So it's not. So even though, we would just logically read our Gospels and then see Paul copying that later on, actually no, Luke took that from Paul and then incorporated that story into his own Gospel, which, of course, the story goes back to the original source, but it came to Luke through Paul. So I hope that makes sense. But only to say that we see some of the Pauline stuff coming through in Luke as well. So as we saw, these two works are dedicated to Theophilus. Who's Theophilus? We don't really know. He's the best guess is that he's the patron who paid for all of this to happen in the first place. These Gospels, Luke and Acts, would have been extremely expensive to write, and the work that Luke would have had to have done to research them would have been quite extraordinary, particularly when you look at the end of Acts, where you've got some of the speeches around Paul's trial. A lot of the end of Acts is concentrated on the trial of Paul. And you look at some of the speeches that are being used there, Luke would have gone to the original sources. The Romans were very good at keeping records of their trials and just keeping general legal documents. What Luke would have done is gone back to those sources. He would have gone to Rome and gathered up, or he would have seen some of those sources and then incorporated those into his gospel. So he's done the historical research. That would have looked like Luke traveling around a bit and asking eyewitnesses, talking to people in the different churches about their own accounts of not just of Jesus, but also of Peter and Paul, and to be able to gather together all of those stories, all of that information, and then create his own gospel. Because remember, he's drawing on Mark, but only to create the gospel of Jesus. Mark has no idea of the continuing, well, he would have had some idea, but there were so many other stories in Acts that obviously Mark would have no idea about, and some of them that Luke knew about, but also just generally going and interviewing, talking to people in the early days of the church, going back to the early chapters of Acts back in Jerusalem. That information had to come from somewhere. And so Luke's done his work. That would have cost a lot of money, not just the time in researching, but also the time to write the Gospels themselves and publish them. Someone had to pay for that. So this Theophilus is almost certainly going to be the person who's funded that. And so he gets a shout out at the start of both of them. This Theophilus, you sort of commissioned me to do this. And it seems from Luke's description that Theophilus is kind of asking for his own account. He wants his own personal sort of researched story, not just of Jesus's life, but what happened next. Why is it that this church took off? How is it that it goes from, this Jewish baby born in some backwater town in Nazareth to now being this message that goes all the way to Rome? How is that possible? Well, that's what he seems to have wanted to commission somebody to go and write, and so that's where Luke steps into the picture. But the point of the story is that it's showing how this message started from this epicenter in Nazareth to finishing with Paul preaching to literally the king of the world at the end of Acts. It's really quite a remarkable story how this sort of this insignificant message goes all the way to Rome and ends up at the feet of the emperor. That's sort of the extraordinary part. And what Luke is developing throughout both accounts is how it gets to be there. So looking first at the gospel, it's the life of Jesus, but with a stress on Jesus being more of a savior to everybody, not just to the Jews, but to everybody, including the Gentiles. And so again, you get the story of the Good Samaritan, but there's a heavier emphasis on sinners more broadly, that he's a Jesus to the nations, and a greater stress on women. You get a lot more mention of the women that were involved in Jesus' ministry as well. But again, looking more broadly, just beyond the small Jewish circles to everybody. Everybody is incorporated into the story, and Jesus was a savior to everybody. So Luke wants to sort of draw that out throughout the gospel, but then when he gets to Acts, what he's doing is showing how the story continued. And that's what's so exciting about the story, because it really builds up. It really ramps up quite quickly. And it's within the first generation how we go from, again, this tiny little story and, finishing in Jerusalem, seemingly the story's over. Seemingly they've squashed the story, or the fire's been put out where Jesus has been crucified. But no, the story continues. Not only does it continue, but it spreads. They thought they put out the flames, but they missed one little ember, and the spirits fanned that into flame, and then all of a sudden it's taken off around the world. That's what's so remarkable about how all of this has turned out. And so the beginning of Acts really frames this. Jesus' last words to his disciples are that, you're going to receive the Spirit and you're going to be my witnesses in Judea and then Samaria, and then so Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and then to the ends of the earth. And that's literally how Acts is framed. It begins in Jerusalem and then they're scattered. And so they go into the regions of Judea and Samaria because of the persecution that happens under Saul, who becomes Paul. He sort of persecutes and scatters the church, and so they start to spread, but they only go amongst the Jews. But then when Paul picks up the story later on, it goes into the rest of the world. And so if you actually look, if you follow sort of the sections of the story, sort of Acts 1 to 6 is focused still in Jerusalem, but then chapters 6 to 9, we're going from Judea into Samaria as well. So we're starting to move out of the realms of just Jerusalem by itself. And then from chapters 9 to 12, we're moving out into the Gentile world. So this is Paul's sort of earlier work. Peter's going into the Gentile world with Cornelius, and then we're sort of picking up Paul into the story. And this is where the narrative shifts much more quickly. We go from 12 to 16, where we're moving into the regions of Asia. So if we go over into places like Ephesus, Galatia, those areas, we're moving across the continent now, out of Judea and Samaria, across into Asia Minor. And then when we go from chapter 16 to 19, we're moving into Europe. So now we're over into to the next continent. And then finally, chapters 19 to 28, we see the journey going up into Rome. So it literally is to the ends of the earth. It's showing how this gospel has been, or Jesus's final command is getting fulfilled in these disciples. And what we also see is a significant shift that takes place between Peter and Paul. The first half of Acts is focused on Peter, who was the apostle to the Jews, but then the second half picks up on the life of Paul, who's carrying it to the ends of the earth. And so in part, the story, you imagine Luke picking up the story from Paul, because that's where Luke comes into the story. Luke comes in at about Acts 16, around about Philippi, and that's when Paul's story continues on. But it's because Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, well, then naturally the story is going to be focused on him, because he's the one who's taking the gospel into the ends to the rest of the world. And what we also know from Paul's own accounts, especially in Romans, is that Paul's desire is to get to Spain. Now, we don't see Spain in the book of Acts, but that's Paul's intention, and he very likely got there after his imprisonment. He probably very likely got to Spain. Now, what was so significant about Spain? Well, if in the first century, as far as they were concerned, the world ended in Spain. Spain is on the westernmost part of Europe. After that, it's all ocean. Now, they did know about Britain, but they didn't know about anything else. And if you keep traveling across the Atlantic, where you end up is in North America. Well, they didn't know that there was a North America. They didn't discover that, or they didn't find North America until the 16th century with Columbus. So you've got, at that point, their understanding was that the world ended at the edge of Europe, which at that point was Spain, and that's when Jesus was going to return. Jesus said, get to the ends of the earth and then I'll come back. And so that was always their intention. And so what we see Acts doing is carrying that story out all the way out into Rome. But the story itself actually finishes with Paul imprisoned in Rome. Now, that leads to some suggestions as to the reason for the writing of this gospel, which is to give something of a legal defense of the Christian message. Paul is about to face trial in front of the Emperor Nero, who was the emperor at the time. And what this gospel may very well have been, in part at the least, would be something of an account of Christianity. Paul is about to face trial for treason, amongst other things. He's been, there's been some pretty serious accusations that have been made against him. And so what Luke is trying to do is to write something of a defense on Paul's behalf. So there may have been something of that in the reasons for his writing of that. But if it was written afterwards, you say, well, Paul's dead by that stage, and so maybe it's a sort of retroactive defense of Paul, perhaps, or perhaps just generally something of a defense of the Christian message, which is becoming more prominent in this increasingly suspicious Roman world. That all may have played a part as well in why Luke wrote this. Again, we don't really know the intentions completely, but all of these sort of make for good speculation. What is frustrating about the gospel, and I say frustrating because this really is frustrating, is that the way Acts actually ends. It really finishes on a cliffhanger. So the end of Acts actually literally says, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. So this is a real cliffhanger. And I remember reading this when I first read through the New Testament. I got to the end of Acts and I was hooked. I was just absolutely fascinated by this story. But then it finishes with Paul in prison and you go, what happened next? Now, I kind of had a sense that Paul, died in prison or he was martyred in Rome. That's sort of a general knowledge. But I had, what happens next? Why doesn't this story tell us the end? And so then I turned over to Romans and I thought, oh, this must be the completion of the story. And then I realized very quickly this is not the continuation of Acts. I had no idea what it was until my youth pastor at the time told me, actually, that's a letter. And I felt like a dummy. But the story itself, it finishes so abruptly. There's Paul in prison. We know that he died, but why didn't you tell us the story? Did he get to Spain? That was another thing that he was trying to do. Like, what the heck happened here, Luke? Like, why? Tell us the rest of the story. But that's actually the point. Luke finishes the story almost mid-sentence because what he's trying to do rhetorically is to make the point that the story's not finished, right? Acts 28 finishes in Rome with Paul coming to the end of his missionary work. We don't know what happens next, at least based on Luke's account. But Acts 29 needs to be written by you. You complete Acts 29. That's the point. The story's not done yet. Paul got the ball rolling. Now it's up to us to finish it. So we are the completion of the story. So that the rhetorical device is that it brings us into the story. We can see where it begins, but the story's not over yet. But there's another sort of dimension to it as well, which is that we know that Paul was eventually martyred in Rome. He was eventually killed under Nero in Rome, probably either 64 or 67. Now, when Luke's writing this gospel, everybody knows that story. Okay, by that point, Paul's execution is much closer to the time of Luke's writing, and so his audience would very well know the story of Paul and how he was martyred. They may not know the story so much about Jesus in the early days of the church. So Luke's trying to fill in all those, he's sort of backfilling those details for an audience who's just coming into the message freshly. They don't know a lot of the history of it. So he's writing a bit of a history to sort of fill them in on the details and then bring them up to where they are today, which is that Paul had recently been martyred. So it's a little bit like if you're trying to tell the backstory of World War II, the story you're going to tell is about Nazi expansion. You're going to tell the story about the expansion of Hitler and the Germans throughout Europe, and how he took a lot of land before the war actually began. And then if you were trying to leave it on a cliffhanger, if you're trying to bring people up to the point of the story that they know about, you would say, and then it comes to September 1939 and the Nazis roll into Poland. Now, of course, at that point, World War II breaks out. Everybody knows what happens from there, but you may not know the backstory. Luke's kind of doing something like that. He's finishing the story at the point where you know the rest. I don't need to say it again, but this is what's been happening up to that point. Okay, so that sort of finishes the story of Luke. That just leaves us then with John. Now, John is very different. He's a completely different gospel to the other two. In fact, John has 90% different material to the other authors. So that tells us that if he's drawing on Mark, it's only very loosely, with only maybe a few bits and pieces. What John is doing is bringing a completely different set of traditions to the story. And that raises the question of why. What is it? What is so different? What's the different purpose around Luke's gospel as opposed to the other ones? Well, if you look at Matthew focuses on Jesus the teacher. Mark, more about Jesus the crucified king, whereas Luke's more about Jesus the savior of the world. Well, what John's trying to bring is the revelation, or just showing the divinity of Christ. Jesus is God's glory revealed. And that's really the emphasis of what John is doing. He's not hiding the ball. Mark is very secretive about Jesus being the Messiah. Just don't tell anybody what you know. Whereas John is upfront from the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And right from the very first verse is the idea that Jesus is God incarnate, that he was the eternal God. He was the Logos for all of eternity, who's become flesh and revealed himself before us. He puts that right out at the start, and everything else that comes after that is the explanation, or it's the proof that Jesus is indeed God made flesh. But there's also another dimension to what John is doing, and we don't have time to go into some specific examples of this, but what John is trying to do is to reveal something more of a philosophical side of the gospel. John's probably writing later on, and he's writing to a Greek world. He's writing to a world that is heavily informed by Greek philosophy. And so what John's trying to do is match the idea. He's trying to show that this Christian message can hold its own in a philosophical debate. A philosophical debate around the nature of our existence, the nature of eternity, the nature of reason and understanding, or as the Greeks would call it, the logos. What John's trying to do is to bring sort of a philosophical defense of the gospel to show that this isn't just a bunch of silly stories. Actually, there's something deep and profound about this idea, and something about this message that is, well, what philosophy is trying to do, which is to reveal the ultimate truth of the universe. Well, that's what this story is also trying to do. So John's kind of bringing that element to it as well, and revealing that through the life of Jesus. So the question is raised about the authorship. Who actually wrote this gospel? Well, obviously it's attributed to John, but which John? I mean, John's a pretty common name even today. It was certainly a common name in the ancient world. So which John are we talking about? Well, the assumption has always been that it's John the Beloved, John, the disciple of Jesus, as in John, the brother of James. So James, John, sons of Zebedee, that's the John that wrote this gospel. Now, we actually get a clue at the end of the gospel, where he says in 21:24, he says, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." So he's referring then to this, the one who Jesus loved. Now, we get specific references to this guy beginning in John 13, and again through 3 other times, we get this specific mention of this John who Jesus loved. And so again, the assumption would be that this is John, the brother of James, but it doesn't actually specify which John that it is, only that there was a John that Jesus loved. Now, again, the tradition is always that it's John, one of the 12, but what we find out later on from one of the church fathers, Papias, is that there were actually 2 Johns who were of significance in the early church, John the disciple, but also John the elder. And so there was this other important John the elder, who was also a prominent player. And so interestingly, when we look at 1, 2, and 3 John, remember those little tiny little letters at the back of your New Testaments, those were written by the same John who wrote this gospel. At least that's how it's always been understood. He wrote all four of these texts. And in those letters, they're actually addressed from the elder John, not just John, but the elder John. So there's this other John that we know about, and he identifies himself as being the one who wrote those epistles. So if he's the one that wrote the epistles and is the same one that wrote the gospels, then who is this guy? Who is this elder John? He mustn't be John the disciple. He must be some other guy. Well, interestingly, in John 21, where it's talking about John the one, this is the one who wrote these down. In John 21, 1-2, it names the people that were there. So this is when Jesus is down on the beach. He's been resurrected. He's appearing again to his disciples, and he's at this beach, and he appears to, well, they named them Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, right? And so John and James. So one of those is the John that is traditionally identified as the author, and two other disciples were there together. Who are these other two disciples, these unnamed disciples? And how did this guy know about that? So it's assumed that amongst these other two unnamed disciples is this other John, this other guy who may have actually been the author of that. And when we actually look back at these accounts of the one that Jesus loved, John, the one that Jesus loved, this guy doesn't get introduced until John 13. So halfway through the gospel is when we meet this guy, and we don't meet him until Jesus gets down to Judea. So Jesus comes from Nazareth, which is up in Galilee. Down in Judea is where he meets the one who he loves. So who's this guy? Well, maybe we're talking about another John, another disciple who wasn't one of the 12, but was a close associate of the team, the one who Jesus loved, somebody from Judea. That could be who we're talking about here. So all that to say, there's sort of two schools of thought on who the author of John might be. It might be James, so John, the brother of James, one of the 12, son of Zebedee, or it could be this other John, this elder John, who wrote the other epistles as well, and might have been sort of a second layer or secondary disciple, close to Jesus, but not one of the inner 12. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. We've got the gospel, and it's from somebody who was closely associated with either the 12, being one of the 12, or somebody very closely associated with the team. That's certainly good enough for the account of it. What's more important really about what the gospel is trying to do is that it's got a obviously different perspective, or it's got a different purpose to what the other gospels are. When you read the other three gospels, they're much more historical. Mark is telling a historical account of Jesus' life. It's talking about the events that happened, and remembering in the context, in the genre of a bios, or these bioi types of accounts, these biographies of these famous heroes. What it's trying to do is to tell the stories, tell the anecdotes that made this person famous in the first place. And so that's very much what Mark's trying to do. Luke is drawing out of that, Jesus, the savior of the world, Jesus who isn't just a hero for the Jewish people, but also for Gentiles. Matthew's looking much more at the Jewish teacher, the fulfillment of the Old Covenant. Still the historical Jesus, still very much the stories about the events that made Jesus famous. You don't get as many of those. You don't get as many miracles. You don't get as many healings. You don't even get any exorcisms in John. He's not focused on the stories and the events strung together of Jesus' life. What you get in John instead are these long dialogues, these long teachings. And so think about Jesus sitting down with Nicodemus, taking up all of John chapter 3. You get these long, lengthy dialogues of Jesus more the philosopher, Jesus more expanding on his teachings and his ideas in greater depth. And that really gives you a sense then of what John's trying to achieve. It's revealing that Jesus is indeed the Son of God. He is God manifest, but he's also trying to sort of bring a deeper explanation philosophically of just some ideas that were just dropped in the Synoptic Gospels, just some basic ideas or some historical anecdotes that took place. Here's the explanation of that. And this is a pretty typical sort of practice that philosophers would have. They would appoint a particular student, one of their sort of more preferred or smarter students perhaps, and that student would be appointed as their interpreter. So they would be the ones who would not just hold the traditions, but hold on to the explanations of them, be the ones that were appointed to really unpack them in greater detail and really draw out all the implications of that. That's exactly what John's trying to do. He's kind of like that trusted, beloved disciple, bringing about that explanation, that interpretation. So what John's really doing is that he's taking some of the stories that the audience will be familiar with from Mark. Mark is, everybody knows Mark's gospel by that point. That's sort of the authoritative gospel. And John, I forgot to mention the dating, probably written later in the 80s, maybe even up to 90 AD. Everyone knows Mark's gospel at that point. What John is doing with that is going, this is why he did it, or this is what he meant by that. This is the explanation for that story that you're already so familiar with. Well, this is the why. Not just the what or the when, but this is the why of that. And so we get examples in John 2:22. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. You get examples of that through the gospel now that we know the story, this is sort of the aftermath of that. This is sort of the after effects of how that or what that was all about. So that's something of John's point of view. Now, again, we've only very briefly touched on these Gospels. We can come back to these at a later point and go into them in some greater depth, only to sort of give you a sense of the beginning point. So John, again, being something of the interpreter, what he sort of finishes with, it's not just a summary of his gospel, but really just kind of a summary of what all four of these gospels are trying to do. And he says there right at John chapter 20, verse 31, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah. In fact, just before this, what he said is that, I could write, if we were to write down all the stories of Jesus, there wouldn't be enough books to contain them. And really that's sort of a fact. There were so many traditions getting around of Jesus that what we've got is just a sampling of them, just a small core group of traditions that we have. But then John says, we could write them all down and there wouldn't be books to contain them. But he says, but these were written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's a really good way to end his gospel, because he's sort of giving an explanation of why am I doing this, what's the purpose of this particular task. But really what it is a statement for all of the gospels. All four of them were written down so that all the generations who are coming after can read these and understand not just who Jesus was, but what his purpose was. Understand that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, that he was what these authors are claiming him to be. And, well, what are you going to do with that? Here's the man. Here's the historical stories. Here are some of the facts about his life. Here are some of his teachings. And from John's point of view, here's the implication of those. Here's the significance, the eternal significance of what these stories are. Take all four of these Gospels together, get this complete picture of the life of Jesus from all of his different aspects and the different impacts he had in all walks of life. Take all of that together, and then, well, what are you going to do with that? Well, that's up to you. Now it's your job to sift through all of this and ask the question, what does this mean for me? What is this saying for my life? What am I going to do with this Jesus? With everything I know now about him, what am I going to do about him? What role is he going to play in my life? Do I believe that he is who these authors say that he is? And if he is, again, what am I going to do with that? And so maybe that's a nice way just to finish not just this episode, but this whole series. And so hopefully that has been helpful in giving you something of a deeper sense then of what these Gospels are, and certainly help you in your reading. As I said, we can probably come back later on and look at these in much greater depth. But for now, we'll finish up this series and we're going to move on to a new one in a couple of weeks, looking at the letter to the Corinthians. So we'll come to that soon, only to say thank you so much for joining. So thank you so much for being here and for persevering through this series. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.